Legislation designed to combat illegal financing activity was introduced last year by the federal government. With me today is Marc Rossi, Restructuring, Insolvency and Recoveries partner at Hicksons, and he's been called to account to share his insights into the impacts of the new amendments on directors and other stakeholders. Welcome, Marc. Thanks for joining me today. So the amendments introduce new offences for financing activity, as well as civil and criminal penalties for directors that engage in illegal financing activity. And we talk about this during today, but there's a fine line between legal and illegal financing. Would you care to explain where that line fits?
Sure. Yes, it does beg the question whether there is such thing as a legal Phoenix. And the short answer to that is yes, genuine company failures do happen. So a director who has responsibly managed a company that unfortunately fails can certainly operate the same business through another company without necessarily illegally Phoenixing. So what would be required is a legal restructure of a company. And a legal restructure would involve transferring assets which have been independently and properly valued to a new company for the true and market value of those assets. And if you do that, then you should be fine.
So tell me, what are some of the other features of the amendments?
Yeah, sure. So we did cover already the new offences and civil penalty provisions to stop creditor-defeating dispositions of company property and to penalise those who engage in or facilitate such dispositions. So on top of those, we have liquidators and ASIC can now go after property, the subject of creditor-defeating dispositions, to try and recover that back. Company directors are now prevented from improperly backdating directorship resignations or ceasing to be a director when this will leave the company with no directors. And those reforms officially started on 18 February 2021 after a year-long transition period. On top of those, we have company directors are now personally liable for a company's unpaid GST liability, so that's quite a big thing. And the ATO is entitled to retain tax refunds where there are outstanding tax lodgements.
Now, I think a little bit lost in there, Marc, was the word facilitator. And this is quite interesting or quite novel about the new legislation, as it is not just going after directors, but it's going after those who might facilitate the activity. So that would cover people like lawyers, accountants, business valuers, anyone that might assist the directors in that activity.
Yes, that's right. So very important is that not only can directors be prosecuted, but other professionals as well, as you mentioned, Paul.
And what should directors and facilitators keep in mind so they don't fall foul of the new amendments?
Yeah, so as previously mentioned, before transferring assets of the company out, we should make sure that they have been properly and independently valued. That's very important. If they are transferred, just making sure that they're transferred for true and market value and for proper consideration, etc. And making sure that the proceeds come back to the company so that they can become available for creditors of the company. On top of those things, just make sure that debts and liabilities are paid, ensure good internal reporting systems, make sure that BAS and SGC statements are lodged on time, so that's very important, particularly in relation to director penalty notices. Keep on top of PAYG and SGC payment obligations. Don't leave the company without a director, but of course resignations will still be effective. If, for example, a director resigns on a particular day and another one is appointed on that day, that's okay, that's a temporary absence of a director. Or if the resignation takes place during when the company is being wound up, that's also fine. And of course, be vigilant, act early and obtain early advice because there are protections, exceptions and defences as well in relation to these reforms.
A moment ago you mentioned the importance of getting any of the assets of the business, including IP, properly valued before it's transferred to the new company.
That's where you come in.
That's where we come in, and of course it's a very interesting scenario, because when we talk about market value, we're often talking about a willing seller and a willing buyer. But in a solvency situation, which is more of a fire sale situation, the basis for valuation becomes a little bit more grey. And I guess particularly when you're then also valuing an asset that's going to be transferred to a related party, there's a whole lot of other issues around what is market value that will come into play. So again, coming back to an earlier point, it is very important that you get the right independent value in there to value the full assets of the company and take, of course, consideration of all those sorts of issues around valuing.
Agreed.
But can you see the new amendments causing directors and facilitators to think twice before engaging in illegal phoenixing activity?
Yeah, it's still early days in terms of these reforms, so there's not much out there yet in terms of case law, which might be a good thing. But I certainly think we'll see a change to that going forward, unless of course these laws are so effective that there's 100% deterrence from engaging in this activity. I think the reforms will be effective and have some effect in stopping this activity, mainly because directors are now prevented from improperly backdating directorship resignations or leaving the company without a director, as we previously touched on. There are hefty penalties involved, so you're looking at imprisonment of up to 15 years.
Wow.
Yeah, fines of around $1 million, as well as compensation to be paid back to the company. So those are, yeah, quite compelling things not to do that.
And of course that goes not just for the directors, but for the facilitators.
Facilitators as well, yeah. Other professionals as well can be caught up. And of course, ASIC's drive and motivation to crack down on this activity. You don't want to be in the
No. And do you think that the amendments will deliver better outcomes for creditors?
That's a good question. I think there will be some form of good returns for creditors in line with these reforms. I think the first thing, the ATO, for example, can now go after directors personally for unpaid GST liabilities. So the ATO has an extra avenue of recovery, if you like, particularly if the company goes under, to go after directors personally. So that helps the ATO as a creditor. Second, obviously the reforms add to a liquidator's arsenal in terms of going after assets for the benefit of creditors. So it's like an extra voidable transaction claim, if you like.
Right.
So ideally that would lead to clawbacks,
Yep.
which the creditors can avail of. And I think just by design, these laws seek to keep assets or proceeds of assets with the company. And of course, if the assets are there, as opposed to being siphoned out for no or undervalue, you'd like to think that the creditors would be able to benefit from the assets or proceeds of assets that are there, as opposed to them going somewhere.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for your time today. It's been most insightful.
Thanks.
I guess there's a couple of takeaways for me. It's very much about directors and facilitators being caught by the new amendments to prevent the anti-phoenixing, the stiff penalties that are involved. But on the flip side, if your company is looking down the barrel of needing or moving to insolvency and needing a restructuring, the message is always going to be get the right advice and get that advice early.
Particularly around valuations, that's key. So,
Thank you very much, Mark, and we'll see you next time.
thank you.